this is, I'm talking with you guys about an historical occurrence, which is the exploitation of George and Willie Muse. I know about this. I learned about this initially from an interview between Beth Macy and Terry Gross from the podcast Fresh Air. It's mostly a book interview show. George and William Muse were 6 and 9 years old when they began working for a freak show in 1899. So this is a long time ago now. And here's a picture of them. They were billed as Eco and Ico. Here are more pictures. So this is, the way they were exploited, right? They were working in this freak show, but they were costumed and framed, presented as, in different ways to sort of make them seem more exotic and enticing. So here's a picture of the two of them being billed as sheep-headed cannibals from Ecuador. Beth Macy points out that because these kids were albino African Americans, they were regarded as rarities. Because they were so unusual. And here's a quotation from the interview. Beth Macy says, they were considered pretty good finds, especially in the early years. The pecking order would have been, say, Siamese twins. That's an offensive term now. People say conjoined twins. A person with no legs who did tricks, and then perhaps albinos. So people who operated freak shows were kind of always on the lookout for people with disabilities who they could take and use in these freak shows, and then people would pay money to see them. So, sometimes this was a way of getting work for people with disabilities, and the people with disabilities were fully participating in the business operation of this. But many times people were taken without their consent and used in this way. I just wanted to include additional pictures so that you guys could see, in real life, how these freak shows operated. So, here's a photo that shows George and Willie Muse, or Eco and Ico, also known as Eco and Ico, in these, glamorous dress, in this, glamorous dress costume. But also there's this suggestion that they're so alien, they're so exotic. Could you guys all please mute yourselves?
Porque tu dá archivo. Lo está archivando.
No borrando.
Lo está archivando.
Por favor. Okay, sorry. Let me mute all. Please remember to keep yourselves muted unless you have a question. Going back to sharing my screen now. Okay. Here is another picture, again, pitching this idea of the alienness of these two humans, right? Are they from Mars? But you also see it in the context of these other sideshow acts. So, here is a person of small stature, here's a person of large stature, here's a fat person, and, these are just regular people who have some kind of unusual bodily appearance, and they are all being sort of put together as a way of getting money from ordinary people so that they can gawk at those who look unusual. So according to Beth Macy, who wrote this book about the Muse brothers, the circus was the most dominant form of entertainment between 1840 and 1940. And the sideshow, that's, this sort of freak show, was a big part of that. It was a way to get an extra quarter out of a patron. And there would be banners on the side of the tent, right? That's what we were just looking at. There would be banners on the side of the tent trying to entice people to pay that extra quarter. And so there would be photos of Eco and Iko, ambassadors from Mars, or there would be photos of a large woman or a very thin man, the skeleton man. There would be the doll family was a popular family of small performers who were also, many of them cast in The Wizard of Oz. Jack Earl, the Texas Giant, was a big draw during that time. It's kind of strange. It's kind of a strange time to get your head around because it's hard to imagine that people would want to pay money to see people with, some of whom had disabilities. So, here is again a photo that shows the kind of people who would be included in a sideshow. And I want you to observe especially one of the techniques that's being used is that very large people are being put right next to people who are very small to sort of make them look more unusual, to make the tall person look extra tall, to make the small person look extra small. And also, please note that in with these people with disabilities or unusual embodiment, we also have people in exotic costume. That means people who appear to be from other cultures. So here's someone who appears to be in Indian subcontinental dress. Here is someone who again perhaps appears to be from the Indian subcontinent. Here is a person in what looks like might be some kind of African tribal regalia. There were Native Americans in Native American gear in these sideshows. The idea was to present to people who perceive themselves as normal, something outside the norm, and as a way of reinforcing the sense of normalcy that the viewer had about themselves. Here are other photos of people who were included in these slideshows. So over here, this is a person who has, an unusual hand setup, but he's being billed as l'homme grenier. For those of you who speak French, and apologies for my French accent, this means the frog man. Here's a guy who has a medical condition that causes swelling of his legs, but he is being presented as an oddity. Here's another sideshow poster, again, presenting very large people alongside very small people as a way of emphasizing the differences of those bodies. Again, and you can, review these slides yourself if you want to spend more time with some of these photos. Here are people in Chinese, traditional Chinese dress, next to people with hirsute or hairy faces. It's just this mixing together of everything that seems not normal. And again, this is a way of emphasizing or stressing the perceived normalcy of the person who's doing the looking. Part of this exploitation was not just exploitation of the supposedly exotic of foreign people, but also racial exploitation specifically. So there was Oda Benga, who was billed as a missing link between human and ape. He was called a pygmy who had been liberated from the Congo by an American missionary. He was first displayed in 1904 at the World's Fair alongside, we don't use Eskimo anymore, but Native Alaskans, Filipinos, and Native Americans. He was displayed in the Bronx Zoo with an orangutan, right? So in the Bronx, where many of us live, not me, because Brooklyn, but a lot of people living in the Bronx, right there, the Bronx Zoo is right there. Can you believe that the Bronx Zoo literally allowed humans to be displayed in the cages alongside animals as a kind of freak show exhibition.
I learned about that last semester and I was shocked.
Yeah, it's amazing where we've been, and not too long ago. Joyce Heth is another example of a racialized person. So, you know, here's an African American woman who was exploited in this way. Saartjie Baartman is, you know, the most, probably the most notorious example of this racialized woman who was, you know, displayed and assaulted as part of the experience of showing the Black body as something strange and exotic. She was often billed as the Venus Hottentot. So for George and Willie Muse, there are kind of two stories about how this may have happened, how they came to be in the freak show, according to Beth Macy. So in these two versions, one is that they got kidnapped. So one is that the one that every African-American in Roanoke or in Franklin County over the age of, say, 60 would have heard growing up. And they would have heard it as a cautionary tale. Watch out, kids. These two brothers, not that much unlike you, were snatched up from the circus. So when you go out to the fair or festival, be careful or you might get kidnapped like Iko and Iko. So there's one version of this story, and it's not clear, you know, what exactly happened, is that maybe these boys at, you know, 6 years old, so 6 and 9, were kidnapped when they themselves were at the fair as viewers. And they were taken, you know, by other humans and then enslaved to be exhibited this way. But there is also this other version, and no one is quite sure which version is the true fact. Because Harriet Muse was this poor single mother, perhaps she had initially let them go in exchange for pay, right? So that they had a contract where she said, okay, you can take my kids and show them, you know, because we need the money just to survive, but they were supposed to be returned to her. And then one of the showmen took them from another showman and she wanted them back. You know, it was Christmas time. She was expecting them back. She had no idea where they were. According to the family, you know, she reached out to law enforcement. She reached out to the Humane Society of Virginia trying to get them back. And basically, no one lifted a finger to help her. So whether they were actually kidnapped or whether she had a contractual agreement with the person who was exhibiting them is almost immaterial, because either way, they were still her children and she still wanted them back. And at this point, Terry Gross inserts probably because she was African-American, you know, and, you know, this is, Macy says exactly. I mean, this was really a harsh time to be a Black person in Roanoke, Virginia. And there had been a lynching, a really violent lynching, some really severe incidents. There were city codes saying where you could live and where you couldn't live, and a lot of violence here. They were told their mother was dead when they wanted to go back home. And they said, quit crying, your mother is dead. So they're lying to the mother and they're lying to the children in order to keep these boys in the sideshow against their will. So whether it started out as a consensual arrangement or not, it ultimately wound up to be an absolutely exploitative, non-consensual experience of enslavement. I am concerned about the time. It is 12:04. We are actually past time. I understand that people will probably have to leave for other classes or other appointments, and that is perfectly fine. Please put your questions into the chat if you have questions. I'm going to keep going because this is a recorded session, and I would like for people to be able to access the full recording if they'd like. At a certain point, George and Willie Muse were rescued by their mother. This is 1927, so it's really the height of white supremacist violence in the South. This is, at the time of the rebirth of the KKK, where the KKK had this really robust presence and full control of law enforcement and other government authorities in this part of the nation. And, so here's a Black mother in this time, which is, especially dangerous and violent for Black people, taking this risk to get her kids back. And Beth Macy says their mother found her way to the fairgrounds in Roanoke, Virginia, which was just in the southern part of downtown. It was also the site of a roaring KKK rally soon before. And you can see I've included a photo postcard because those postcards were distributed of that rally. And she makes her way to the front of the audience, and in a scene that's been recounted for 4 generations now, Willie, the older brother, sees her, elbows George and says, "Look, there's our dear old mother. She is not dead." And they sort of dropped their instruments, came down from the stage, and were enveloped by her. We know that 8 armed policemen showed up. We know that the head law enforcement officer in the city was also the founder of the local KKK. She could have been arrested, right? So she's taking this giant risk by reuniting with her kids. And the lawyers turned out in droves from Ringling, right? So the circus itself was fighting against her. This one lone woman. They traveled with lawyers, and still she was able to convince 8 police officers and the lawyers that these were in fact her sons. They're saying they're her sons. They're saying they want to go home and spend some time with their mother. And so finally they let her bring them home, right? The boys come home because of the overwhelming force and perseverance of this woman. But, it's not a feel-good story. She's fighting against these, really evil people who have taken her kids. Here's a woman who really fought for herself and her rights and her family. The next day, the mother finds a very ambitious young white lawyer and files a lawsuit for back wages against the greatest show on earth. That's the circus. So she actually sued them. And she did win a sizable settlement. But the very next year, the brothers actually go back to the sideshow. The brothers go back to the circus the next year, probably to help support their mother. I'm sure that was part of it. But this time they were going back on their own terms. It was the only life they knew, and now they were able to make sure that they were actually getting paid. So before, they were doing this as unpaid labor, and they were sending a lot of that money home to their mother, Harriet Muse. So for this week's writing, we are using the Muse brothers' story to think about all of the different factors that made these boys, these men, right? They started out as boys and they became men along the way. What made them especially vulnerable to this kind of exploitation? And we're picking this apart in the abstract because these are going to be the same kinds of points of vulnerability. These are going to be the same kind of factors that make people vulnerable to exploitation that we're going to see across a range of experiences. The first thing is education, right? Did they have contracts? Did they not have contracts? Well, even if they did have a contract, if George and Willie Muse don't have the education, if the authorities representing them, that is their mother, don't have education, which was not possible for most African-American people in the South at the turn of the 20th century, they're operating at a terrible disadvantage, right? Even if there's a contract, how do they enforce the contract if, for instance, they can't read or they don't have access to the kinds of education that would enable them to argue in court? So having less education is definitely something that made the Muse brothers more vulnerable to exploitation, and that makes other people also more vulnerable to exploitation. The fact that they were young also makes them extremely vulnerable to exploitation. And here I'm displaying the cover of a book by Ishmael Bea, A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier, that describes another experience of an exploited child. Children are especially vulnerable to exploitation because they are young, because in our culture they have very little power. So for instance, when we see things like children being separated from their parents at the southern border of the US, we really need to be worried about that, because those children, just as children, are extremely vulnerable to exploitation by adults who are, by definition, people who have more power. This is the experience of George and Willie Muse, who, once they were separated from their mother, were told, oh, your mother's dead, you can't go back. So especially orphaned children, children who are separated, orphaned, abandoned, or otherwise parentless. I wish now that I had, instead of writing race here, used white supremacy as the title for this slide, because it's not Blackness that makes people vulnerable. It is structures of inequality in the US and around the world that makes some racialized people more vulnerable to exploitation than others. So just as an example here, Harriet Muse, the Muse brothers' mom, had reached out to law enforcement, but she's not being served by law enforcement because of white supremacy. So where racial hierarchies are well established, people in subordinate categories, people who are considered to be less, are less able to access law enforcement and other resources. Disability is also a really important factor, not necessarily because disabled people are unable to represent themselves or because they are unable to do stuff, but because people with disabilities, like racialized people, are less valued in the dominant culture. And so people tend not to listen, people tend to turn away. The society does not tend to the needs of disabled people as though disabled people are full people, which they are, which we are. And we'll be reading more about this for the next one of the major essays later in this class. Poverty also is a key factor in vulnerability to exploitation. If you don't have money, you also don't have power to fight back against an unjust system. And the Muse brothers were coming from an impoverished background. So for this week's informal writing, I'm going to want you to take just one of those contributing factors and to put together a single 3-part paragraph using evidence from either this slideshow or from the transcript of the interview with Beth Macy, in order to use that as evidence to back up your point about that being a contributing factor to George and Willie Muse being exploited.